It's new month, which means it's time for another question and answer video here at Wicked Art Studio. This is where I take your questions and comments and answer them in video format. Remember, if I choose one of your questions or comments to answer in one of these videos, you can send me an email at wickedartstudio@gmail.com with your name and a good mailing address, and I will send you a free Wicked Art Studio sticker pack. It's just my way of saying thank you for your support. Thank you for watching my content and interacting with me in the comments. The first comment or question that I chose to answer in this video comes from Southpaw JE, who wrote, "What type of paper are you painting on that allows you to erase? I painted my sphere on plain copy paper and the eraser was ineffective." This question came from my airbrush beginner exercises, the sphere video that I created a while back, specifically referring to the point where I used an eraser to really intensify the small highlight in the upper corner of that sphere. When you're using subtractive or erasing techniques with your painting, the surface you're actually painting on is not as important as some other factors. Now, having said that, I will say that it is easier and better to use a heavier weight paper or something thicker to paint on. You can do this on a plain white sheet of 20-pound copy paper, and I'll demonstrate that in just a moment on this piece of paper. When I actually created these videos, this was painted on a thicker paper. This is about an 80-pound paper. The thicker paper is a little more forgiving, especially if you're using an electric eraser, but you can erase on this paper as well. So I'll put this up on my easel quickly, and we'll talk about the other factors that really play a role when you are using subtractive or erasing techniques in your painting. The first one is the paint that you're actually using, the brand of paint. As you know, if you follow the channel, I use Createx products pretty much exclusively, and they erase well. The illustration line is a little bit easier to erase. It was actually designed to be erasable. The Wicked line will erase as well, but it also depends on the amount of time between when you've sprayed the color and when you're trying to erase it. And I'll talk about that shortly. Another brand that I've used very successfully with erasing techniques is Comart. Other than that, I can't say how well other brands are going to erase because I just don't have any experience with them. In this demonstration, I'm going to be using Createx illustration colors, the same line that I was using when I created these other videos. I'm using Createx illustration black mixed 1-to-1 with Createx illustration transparent base just to kind of thin it out a little bit. I don't want a really opaque color. And then that was mixed 1-to-1 with 4011 reducer. So I can throw some paint in my airbrush. I'm using an Iwata HPCS. It's got a 0.35 millimeter needle and nozzle. And I have a smaller circle template cut out of the same cheap copy paper, and those of you who are very observant will notice that there's already black overspray around this circle because I've actually already recorded this video once before, but sometimes I'm dumb and I forgot to check the battery on my microphone receiver. So after I had recorded all of this and downloaded it, I realized I had no sound, so I'm doing it a second time. So let's paint some color into this sphere, and then we'll talk about the erasing. So something else that's very important when you're using erasing techniques to know is it's far easier to erase paint when it's lightly applied, as I've just done here. I could come in with an eraser and erase this very easily because it's fresh paint and it was literally just applied. I say that, but it's hard to tell if that's actually erasing anything or not. Let me apply some more paint, but it is easier to erase paint when it's not applied super heavy. So kind of doing the same thing that I did in the sphere video previously. Going to add some shading onto this one to make it look like an actual ball. You'll notice I'm still leaving the center section where I want the highlight to be relatively light. It's heavier in the shadowed area. And gradually fading into the highlight. Use a little bit of air to dry this. And then we can remove the mask. And this is not super clean, it's not meant to be. This is a quick demonstration. So I've literally just sprayed the paint onto this thin sheet of 20-pound copy paper. I have two different erasers that I like to use. These are both pencil erasers. The first one is a softer, less aggressive eraser. If you can see this in the camera, it's got a pink tip. The second one is a harder, more aggressive eraser. It has a white colored tip. The first one is designed more for erasing pencil lines, whereas this one is designed more for erasing ink lines. The type of eraser that you use sometimes makes a big difference on the effect that you get. It's also important when you're using erasing and subtractive techniques to use those techniques quickly. You don't want to allow this paint to sit and dry. Although the Createx illustration colors were actually designed to be erasable, it depends on the amount of time that has passed since you've actually sprayed the color and how long the time is before you try to erase the color. Because the longer this sits and has time to cure, the harder that paint gets and the harder it will be to try and erase that later. So let's try with the less aggressive pink pencil eraser first. So if we come in to our highlight area and start making just small circular patterns with this softer eraser in the highlight area, you can see it's beginning to remove some of this paint. This softer, less aggressive eraser is not going to remove paint extremely fast. You might have to work at it a little bit, even though I literally just sprayed this paint onto this piece of paper. But you can definitely see that it is removing some paint. That highlight is starting to become a little bit brighter in the area where I left the paint thinner because I knew I was going to put a highlight here anyway. The other nice thing about this softer, less aggressive eraser is it tends to blend nicely. So you don't get a super harsh edge where you're erasing. It blends into the existing paint nicely. You get a faded edge versus a sharp, crisp edge. We could try the same thing down here in the secondary highlighted area where the paint was a little bit thicker. And it's erasing some of the color, but it's not erasing a lot of the color. What if we had a secondary highlight down here in the bottom corner where it's really dark? As you can see, that's a lot less effective. It's having a hard time with this soft eraser removing the paint where it was applied more heavily. So let's try the more aggressive, harder eraser and see what we get. And one thing I will say is when I use both erasers on a project, you can see how I'm keeping this more aggressive eraser in a smaller area. I'm not taking it out all the way to the edge of the area we erased with the softer eraser because, again, I want to keep it a little bit of a blend. That's definitely removing more paint more rapidly. And you can vary your pressure as well to try and get that to blend out a little bit. Now I'm taking this a little bit farther than I normally would, just for demonstration purposes. But it's definitely removed paint nicely to pretty much the white of the actual paper in the highlight area. What if we came back down in here where the paint was applied more heavily? You can see this eraser is actually removing paint, but now you can really see it's not blending out really softly and nicely. It's a pretty harsh edge, and I'm having to work the eraser pretty good in order to remove that paint. So as you can see, you absolutely can erase on a cheap 20-pound piece of copy paper. What really makes the difference is the brand of paint that you're using, the type of eraser that you're using, and the time frame between when the paint was applied and when you're actually trying to erase that paint. There was one other eraser that you can use for this purpose, and that is an electronic eraser. I like these because you can get both the soft and the aggressive tips for these erasers. This one is a little more aggressive just because you actually have an electric motor assisting you with removing the paint. This can literally remove paint really fast. Even in the darkest areas. So the biggest thing that I would caution against when you are practicing on a very thin sheet of paper like this is if you get too aggressive with your eraser, especially the electric eraser, it's not terribly difficult to erase all the way through the paper, which is not a good thing. But hopefully that answers your question. You can erase on just about any surface. There are obviously some surfaces that erasing techniques are not going to work on, but the vast majority of them, it's going to depend on the actual eraser that you're using, the amount of pressure that you're using, the paint brand, and the time frame between when the color was sprayed and you're trying to erase that color. The next question comes from Douglas Zeef, who wrote, "What size needle were you using for your different layers?" This question was actually posted on one of my Creating Fire with Createx colors videos, but I've seen this question come up several times over the last few months, and I'm not 100% sure why. That's also part of the reason why I mentioned the fact that I was using my Iwata HPCS Eclipse airbrush with a 0.35 millimeter needle and nozzle set when I was answering the first question in this video. What I think might be behind this question being asked is those who are newer to airbrushing or brand new to airbrushing that may have the belief that using a airbrush with a finer or smaller size needle will allow them to achieve better detail. And that's not necessarily the case. You still need to put the work in, the time practicing in order to really develop your fundamental control over the airbrush. In the hands of a skilled artist, it doesn't matter what needle is in the airbrush. You can still achieve some really fine details with either a 0.15 or a 0.50. It doesn't matter. In the hands of somebody who has really good control over the airbrush, they can achieve really good detail. So don't fall into that trap thinking you need a different airbrush specifically for detail purposes. If you're just starting, concentrate on practicing, developing that fundamental control. Once you have really good control of the brush, you'll be surprised at the level of detail you can achieve with just about any airbrush. For future reference, my airbrushes don't get modified. I don't generally change out the needle or the fluid nozzle on my airbrush. They remain whatever they came with from the factory. For example, the HPCS Eclipse, the needle and the nozzle are exchangeable with the Revolution, which is a 0.5. So you could have either or. You could put a 3.5 in a Revolution siphon fed airbrush, or you could put the 0.5 into the Eclipse gravity feed airbrush. I leave my airbrushes alone. Now, having said that, I do have a few airbrushes that came with different options of needles and nozzles in with the airbrush set when I bought it. So in the future, when I use one of those, I will try to make it a point to let you guys know which needle I'm actually using for whatever it is that I'm working on. But for the most part, if I say I'm using an HPCS Eclipse, then it's got a 0.35 millimeter needle and nozzle in the airbrush. The next question comes from Pedro Giovanni, who wrote, "Hey Trevor, could you please expand on what a minigun is? I am just getting into painting and don't know enough. Also, what air pressure would you use with a minigun, and what brand would you recommend for a beginner who may not continue with this new hobby? Thanks in advance." This is one of those questions that I get every now and then that make me stop and think that maybe I'm not doing such a great job, because I have a tendency to take for granted the knowledge that I already have, and I just assume that everybody watching knows exactly what I'm talking about. Sometimes that's not the case. You don't know what you don't know. Sometimes I have to remind myself that there are literally people that are just starting out in this hobby and have no idea what I'm talking about. So I apologize for that. A mini spray gun is exactly what it sounds like. It's a smaller version of a full-size gun. So in my left hand, I have an Iwata LPH 440. It's a full-size gun. In my right hand, I have an Iwata LPH 80, which is just a smaller version of the larger gun. Why would I choose to use one over the other? Depends on what I'm working on and how much paint I need. If I'm painting an entire vehicle, yes, I will use the full-size gun because it's going to require a lot more paint. If I'm just painting one panel, I'm probably going to choose the minigun because it's a little bit more efficient. When it comes to the air pressure, I generally use the air pressure that the manufacturer recommends for whatever gun you're using. I've found over the years that the recommended air pressure is usually where the gun performs best. It doesn't matter what brand of spray gun I'm using, I generally stick with whatever they recommend. When it comes to recommending brands for a beginner, I don't necessarily recommend using an Iwata or a SATA, which are the two guns that I prefer to use most of the time. You can go to the big box store or even find a cheaper version of a small spray gun online. The downsides are it's not going to be as good of a gun. The finish may not quite be as good as a more expensive gun, but this is a lot of money for just a hobbyist, especially if it's somebody that is not certain that they're going to stick with this hobby. So buy a cheap no-name brand gun or some other brand name gun at a big box store or off of the internet if you need one, and then if you don't wind up sticking with it, you're not out but maybe $25 or $30. The last question I chose to answer for this video comes from Juan Salinas, and I had to translate this because I believe it was in Spanish. He wrote, "The bleed checker can be used with a minigun 0.8 and 1.2 to place the product well. Another question is applied wet on wet. I understand the first coat is like fogging and then the second coat wet. How long is left to dry between coats? About 40 minutes. Obviously there was a little bit of a language barrier here, but I think I can decipher what Juan was asking. The first part of his question is, can you apply 4040 bleed checker with either a 0.8 or a 1.2 millimeter needle and nozzle set in a mini spray gun? The answer is yes, you absolutely can. I personally would prefer a needle and nozzle set at a 1.2 versus the 0.8, simply because 4040 bleed checker is a little bit thicker material and we don't reduce it. Remember, we spray that directly out of the bottle. So I would prefer the 1.2, but you can get away with spraying it through a 0.8 millimeter needle and nozzle set. He asked if you could apply it wet on wet. The answer to that is absolutely not. You want to allow that first or second, whichever coat you're spraying, to dry completely before applying an additional coat. You should be able to wipe it down with a tack rag. It needs to be completely dry to the touch before you apply a subsequent layer. That's not only true for the 4040 bleed checker, but that's a good rule of thumb with the entire line of Createx water-based products. He said he understands the first coat is supposed to be fogging it on. That is incorrect as well. You want a good medium wet coat. The idea behind the 4040 bleed checker is to get pinhole free coverage. If you're just fogging the first layer on, you're not getting pinhole free coverage. You're leaving voids where the candy can come up through. So spray a complete coat over the entire surface for every coat. I usually spray 2 coats per session, and then I go back and run a gray Scotch-Brite pad over the entire surface and see if I have any color on that. If I do, I'll apply an additional 2 coats to make sure that it is sealed. How long it takes for the 4040 bleed checker or any of the other Createx products to actually dry to the touch depends on a lot of factors. It depends on the environment you're spraying them in. If it's cold out or humid out, it's going to take a little bit longer for the product to dry. If it's really hot, it will dry a little bit faster. So again, the time frame will vary. 40 minutes, it should be dry within 40 minutes, even if you're not spraying in a booth. But if it needs longer, allow it to dry longer. So that takes care of the questions that I wanted to answer in this month's video. I hope you guys got something out of this. If you did, remember to like, subscribe, and share. If I answered one of your questions, remember to shoot me an email with your name and your mailing address, and I will send you out a Wicked Art Studio sticker pack. Until next time, I'm Trevor with Wicked Art Studio, and I will see you all then.